The hurricane-force winds rattled the emergency room windows as Dr. Sarah Mitchell checked her watch, 3:47 a.m. In 12 hours, she'd treated 43 storm victims, performed 2 emergency surgeries, and saved more lives than she could count. But what she was about to discover in the hospital's basement would make her the 44th victim of Hurricane Helena, and the only one who would never be found. This is the story of how one dedicated doctor's commitment to saving lives led her into the darkest conspiracy in medical history, and how 11 years later, a single ambulance report would expose a corruption so deep it reached the very heart of emergency services across 3 states. But before we dive into what paramedic Jake Torres discovered in that old ambulance, we need to understand who Dr. Sarah Mitchell really was and why her disappearance that night was no accident. Dr. Sarah Mitchell wasn't supposed to be working the night Hurricane Helena hit the coast. She'd volunteered to cover for Dr. Rebecca Hart, who'd called in sick just hours before the storm made landfall. Sarah had already worked a double shift, but she couldn't stand the thought of the emergency room being understaffed during what meteorologists were calling the storm of the century. At 34, Sarah had built a reputation as one of the most dedicated emergency physicians on the East Coast. She'd graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins, completed her residency at Massachusetts General, and had turned down lucrative offers from private practices to work at Mercy General Hospital, a public hospital that served the most vulnerable populations in the city. Her colleagues often joked that Sarah lived at the hospital. She kept a sleeping bag in her office, had 3 backup uniforms in her locker, and knew the night janitors by name. But there was something deeper driving her dedication, something that would make her the perfect target for what was about to unfold. Sarah's younger brother Danny had died in an emergency room 8 years earlier. Not from his injuries, a broken leg from a skiing accident, but from a preventable infection he'd contracted during his hospital stay. The investigation revealed that corner cutting by hospital administrators had led to inadequate sterilization protocols. Danny's death could have been avoided if someone had simply followed proper procedures. Since then, Sarah had made it her mission to ensure that every patient received the highest standard of care, regardless of their insurance status, their ability to pay, or how busy the emergency room happened to be. She filed incident reports when she saw corners being cut. She stayed late to double-check on patients other doctors might have rushed through, and she asked questions when things didn't seem right. What Sarah didn't know was that her reputation for asking difficult questions had already marked her as a person of interest to people far more dangerous than hospital administrators. Her name appeared in a federal database of potentially problematic medical personnel, doctors and nurses who were considered risks to classified operations due to their ethical standards and investigative tendencies. The database had been compiled over years by a joint task force that operated in the shadows of emergency services. They monitored medical professionals across the country, identifying those who might interfere with special operations during national emergencies. Sarah's file contained detailed psychological profiles, her work history, her personal relationships, and assessments of how she might react under pressure. Most disturbing of all, the file contained contingency plans for neutralizing her if she ever became a threat to national security operations. These plans had been sitting dormant in a classified server for 3 years, waiting for the right opportunity to be implemented. Hurricane Helena would provide that opportunity. But Sarah knew none of this as she prepared for what she thought would be just another emergency shift. She checked her equipment, reviewed the patient flow protocols, and mentally prepared herself for a night of saving lives during one of the worst storms in the region's history. On the night Hurricane Helena hit, Sarah's tendency to ask questions would prove fatal. Hurricane Helena made landfall at 11:43 p.m. on October 15, 2009. With sustained winds of 155 miles per hour, it was just shy of Category 5 status, and it hit the coast with the fury of nature unleashed. The storm surge topped 14 feet, flooding entire neighborhoods. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted like weeds, and the casualties began arriving at Mercy General Hospital before the storm had even fully arrived. Sarah had been preparing for hours. She'd organized triage stations, ensured that all critical care equipment had backup power, and coordinated with EMS crews about the best routes to the hospital as roads began to flood. She'd seen bad storms before, but nothing quite like this. The first wave of patients arrived around midnight, A family of four whose car had been crushed by a falling tree. An elderly man who'd had a heart attack while boarding up his windows. A teenage girl who'd been struck by flying debris while trying to secure her family's boat. Sarah moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency. Assess, stabilize, treat, move to the next patient. The emergency room filled beyond capacity, but she never seemed overwhelmed. If anything, she thrived in situations like this when her skills could make the difference between life and death. But as the night wore on, Sarah began to notice something strange. It started with the fourth ambulance crew that brought in patients that night. Sarah had been working with EMS crews for over a decade, and she knew most of the paramedics in the city by name. But she didn't recognize the crew that brought in a 40-year-old construction worker who'd been injured when scaffolding collapsed in the wind. "Where are you guys from?" Sarah asked as they transferred the patient to the trauma bay. "Regional Medical Transport," replied the lead paramedic, a stocky man with cold eyes who introduced himself only as Mike. "We're providing additional coverage for the storm." Sarah nodded and focused on her patient. The construction worker had multiple fractures and was unconscious, but his vital signs were stable. As she worked, she noticed something odd. The man's injuries seemed inconsistent with the story the paramedics had provided. The fracture patterns looked more like he'd been beaten than crushed by falling scaffolding. But storms created chaos, and chaos created confusion. Sarah documented her observations and continued treating the patient. The fifth ambulance brought in a woman who'd allegedly been injured when her basement flooded and she'd fallen down the stairs. Again, Sarah didn't recognize the paramedic crew, and again, the injury seemed inconsistent with the reported cause. The woman had defensive wounds on her arms and hands, the kind Sarah had seen in domestic violence cases. Not accidents. By the time the sixth ambulance arrived with similar circumstances, Sarah knew something was wrong. But what she was about to discover would make her previous concerns seem trivial. At 3:47 a.m., during a brief lull in the patient flow, Sarah decided to review the intake forms from the night. She gathered the charts from the 6 ambulance crews she didn't recognize and spread them out on the nurse's station desk. The pattern was impossible to ignore. All 6 patients had been brought in by crews from Regional Medical Transport, a company Sarah had never heard of despite working with EMS services for years. All 6 patients had injuries that seemed inconsistent with their reported causes, and all 6 patients had been brought directly to Trauma Bay, 3 a room that was typically reserved for the most critical cases. But none of these patients had injuries severe enough to warrant that designation. More disturbing still, all 6 patients had been sedated heavily upon arrival, more than their injuries would typically require. When Sarah checked on them, she found that they were all unconscious and unresponsive, even though their medical conditions didn't warrant such deep sedation. Sarah pulled out her phone and did a quick search for Regional Medical Transport. No results. She tried variations of the name, searched for EMS companies in surrounding counties, even checked state licensing databases. Nothing. The company didn't exist. She was about to call her supervisor when she noticed something else. In Trauma Bay 3, where all 6 mysterious patients had been taken, there was unusual activity. Dr. Marcus Webb, the night supervisor, was in the room with 2 people Sarah didn't recognize, a man in a suit who was clearly not medical personnel, and a woman with a clipboard who seemed to be documenting everything. Sarah approached the trauma bay, but before she could enter, Dr. Webb stepped out and blocked her path. "Dr. Mitchell, I need you to focus on the incoming patients from the storm," he said, his voice unusually stern. "These patients are being handled by a specialized team." "Specialized team?" Sarah questioned. "Marcus, these patients don't need specialized care. Their injuries are relatively minor, and they're all heavily sedated for no medical reason I can identify." Dr. Webb's expression hardened. "Dr. Mitchell, these patients are part of a federal emergency response protocol. You don't have clearance for this information. Please return to your assigned duties." Sarah had known Marcus Webb for 6 years. They'd worked countless shifts together, handled dozens of emergency situations, and she'd never seen him act like this. The Marcus she knew was collaborative, transparent, and always put patient care first. This version of Marcus seemed like a stranger. "Federal Emergency Response Protocol?" Sarah pressed. "Marcus, what aren't you telling me? Return to your duties, Doctor." "Mitchell, that's an order." As Sarah walked away from Trauma Bay 3, Her mind raced. Federal protocols she'd never heard of, patients brought by a non-existent ambulance company, injuries that didn't match their stories, and Marcus Webb acting like someone she'd never met. She decided to do what she'd always done when things didn't make sense investigate. Sarah retreated to her office and closed the door. She pulled up the hospital's patient database and began searching for information about the 6 mysterious patients. What she found made her blood run cold. According to the database, all 6 patients had been admitted, treated, and discharged. But Sarah knew for a fact that they were all still in Trauma Bay 3, unconscious and heavily sedated. Someone had falsified their medical records to make it appear as if they'd been treated and released. She checked the database timestamps. The discharge records had been entered just minutes before she'd started her search. Someone was actively covering their tracks, and they were doing it in real time. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized the implications. This wasn't just medical malpractice or insurance fraud. This was something much more serious and much more dangerous. She needed to document everything she'd observed before someone could destroy the evidence. Sarah opened a new file on her computer and began typing. October 15th, 2009, 4:23 a.m. Patient intake irregularities during Hurricane Helena emergency response. 6 patients brought by unregistered ambulance service. Injuries inconsistent with reported causes. All patients heavily sedated beyond medical necessity. False discharge records entered into hospital database. She was halfway through her documentation when her office door opened without a knock. Dr. Webb stood in the doorway, flanked by the man in the suit she'd seen in Trauma Bay 3. "Dr. Mitchell," Dr. Webb said, his voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk." The man in the suit introduced himself as Agent Collins from the Department of Homeland Security. He was tall, thin, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Dr. Mitchell, you've stumbled into a classified federal operation," Agent Collins said, closing the door behind him. "What you're seeing tonight is part of a larger emergency response protocol designed to protect national security during natural disasters." Sarah's medical training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but her instincts told her she was in serious danger. "What kind of operation requires falsifying medical records and sedating patients without medical justification?" "The kind that keeps this country safe," Collins replied. "During major disasters like Hurricane Helena, certain opportunities arise. Opportunities that allow us to test emergency response protocols, gather intelligence, and ensure that our systems are prepared for larger threats." "You're experimenting on people," Sarah said, the words coming out as an accusation rather than a question. Dr. Webb stepped forward. "Sarah, these individuals were selected because they have no family, no permanent address, no one who would miss them if they disappeared for a few days. We're not hurting them, we're using them to perfect emergency medical procedures that could save thousands of lives in a real crisis." "Selected?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Marcus, listen to yourself. You're talking about kidnapping homeless people and using them as test subjects." Agent Collins' expression didn't change. "Dr. Mitchell, you have 2 choices. You can sign a national security agreement that binds you to secrecy about tonight's events, continue your work here, and receive a substantial monthly stipend for your cooperation. Or," he let the words hang in the air. "Or what?" Sarah demanded. "Or you can become a security risk that needs to be contained." The threat was clear, even though it had been delivered in bureaucratic language. Sarah looked at Dr. Webb, hoping to see some sign of the colleague she'd trusted for years. Instead, she saw a stranger who had chosen his path. "I need time to think," Sarah said carefully. "You have until the end of your shift," Collins replied. 6 a.m. Make your decision by then." After they left, Sarah sat alone in her office, her mind reeling. Everything she'd believed about her workplace, about Marcus Webb, about the medical profession itself, had been shattered in a single conversation. She was being asked to participate in human experimentation, to violate every ethical principle she'd sworn to uphold when she became a doctor. But she was also being threatened. And if Collins was really from Homeland Security, he had resources she couldn't begin to fight. Sarah looked at her computer screen, where her half-finished report still glowed. She could delete it, sign their agreement, take their money, and pretend none of this had ever happened. Or she could finish her documentation and find a way to expose what was happening. She chose the path her brother Danny would have wanted her to choose. For the next hour, Sarah worked systematically to document everything she'd observed. She printed copies of the falsified database records, photographed the patient intake forms, and used her phone to record video of the unconscious patients in Trauma Bay 3. But she knew that documentation wouldn't be enough. If this conspiracy involved federal agencies and hospital administration, her evidence could be dismissed, destroyed, or used against her. She needed an insurance policy. Sarah had a friend from medical school who now worked as an investigative journalist for the Washington Post. Rebecca Chen had built a career exposing medical fraud and government cover-ups. If anyone could help her navigate this situation, it would be Rebecca. Sarah composed a detailed email to Rebecca, attaching all of her evidence and explaining the situation. But before she could send it, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her office, too many footsteps, moving too purposefully for routine hospital traffic at 5 a.m. She quickly saved the email as a draft, cleared her browser history, and locked her computer. Then she slipped out of her office through the back door that connected to the supply closet. From the supply closet, she could hear voices in her office. Collins and at least two other people were searching through her things, checking her computer, looking for evidence of what she might have discovered. Sarah realized she was out of time. Whatever decision she was supposed to make by 6 a.m., they weren't going to wait for her answer. They were moving against her now. She needed to get her evidence out of the hospital before they could stop her. Sarah made her way through the hospital's service corridors, areas she knew well from her years of working late shifts. The storm was still raging outside, which meant the parking garage would be largely empty, and the security cameras would have limited visibility due to the weather. But as she moved through the corridors, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. She could hear footsteps echoing behind her, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Collins had anticipated that she might try to flee, and he'd positioned people throughout the hospital to intercept her. Sarah ducked into a supply closet and waited, listening to the footsteps pass by. Through the crack under the door, she could see beams from flashlights sweeping the hallway. They were conducting a systematic search, checking every room, every hiding place. She needed a different strategy. Sarah remembered that the hospital's basement level connected to the city's old pneumatic tube system, a network that had been used decades earlier to transport documents between buildings downtown. Most of the system had been abandoned, but some of the tunnels were still accessible through maintenance areas. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Sarah made her way to the basement. The power had been partially restored, but the basement was still dark and flooded with several inches of water from the storm. The sound of her movements was masked by the constant dripping and the distant rumble of thunder. She found the access panel for the old pneumatic system behind a wall of storage shelves. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, but it led to a tunnel that extended beneath the city streets. As Sarah squeezed into the tunnel, she could hear voices above her. Collins' team had reached the basement and was conducting their search. She had minutes, maybe less, before they found the tunnel entrance. The tunnel was pitch black and filled with decades of debris, but Sarah used her phone's flashlight to navigate through the narrow space. The tunnel led away from the hospital toward the older part of downtown, where the pneumatic system had originally terminated. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah emerged from the tunnel system in the basement of an abandoned office building 6 blocks from the hospital. She was covered in dirt and debris, exhausted and still in serious danger, but she was alive and free. She reached her car without being seen and quickly started the engine. But as she was backing out of her parking space, she saw Collins and 2 other men entering the garage. They'd found her. Sarah floored the accelerator and raced toward the exit. Behind her, she could see Collins shouting into a radio, coordinating with others. By the time she reached the street, there were already 2 black SUVs following her. The storm worked in her favor. The flooding and debris made it difficult for the larger vehicles to keep up with her small sedan as she navigated through the chaos. She knew the city better than her pursuers, and she used every shortcut and back road she could remember. But she also knew she couldn't run forever. She needed somewhere safe to go, somewhere she could send her evidence to Rebecca Chen and ensure that the truth would come out even if something happened to her. She thought of the one place Collins and his people wouldn't expect her to go, the home of Dr. Rebecca Hart, the colleague whose shift she'd covered that night. Rebecca lived alone in a small house about 20 minutes from the hospital, and Sarah had her spare key from times when she'd watered Rebecca's plants during vacations. Rebecca Hart's house was dark when Sarah arrived, and there were no signs of the black SUVs that had been following her. She used Rebecca's spare key to let herself in and immediately went to Rebecca's computer. Sarah logged into her email account and pulled up the draft message she'd composed for Rebecca Chen. She added a final paragraph explaining that she was being pursued and that if anything happened to her, Rebecca should investigate the federal emergency response protocols being conducted at Mercy General Hospital. She hit send just as she heard car doors slamming outside. They'd found her. Sarah looked around desperately for another way out. Rebecca's house was small, with only one floor and windows that faced the front and backyards. If Collins had people surrounding the house, she was trapped. But then she remembered something Rebecca had mentioned during a casual conversation months earlier. Rebecca's house had been built in the 1940s, and it still had the original basement coal chute that connected to an underground tunnel system used for deliveries during World War II. Sarah found the basement access and the old coal chute. It was narrow and filled with decades of debris, but it led to a tunnel that emerged 3 blocks away behind an abandoned warehouse. As she crawled through the tunnel, she could hear voices and footsteps above her. Collins and his team were searching Rebecca's house, but they wouldn't find the tunnel entrance for several minutes long enough for her to escape. Sarah emerged from the tunnel system covered in dirt and debris, but alive and free. The storm was beginning to weaken, and the first hints of dawn were visible on the horizon. She had survived the night, and her evidence was on its way to someone who could expose the truth. But as she made her way to a nearby 24-hour diner to call for help, Sarah realized she'd missed something crucial. She'd been so focused on the 6 patients and the falsified records that she hadn't asked the most important question. Why had Dr. Rebecca Hart really called in sick that night? Rebecca was one of the most dedicated doctors Sarah knew. She'd worked through flu, food poisoning, and a broken wrist. The idea that she'd call in sick during the biggest emergency the hospital had ever faced was completely out of character, unless she'd been told to stay away. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Rebecca's number. It rang once before going directly to voicemail, not the behavior of a phone that was turned off, but of one that had been programmed to reject specific incoming calls, including calls from Sarah. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Rebecca Hart had been part of the conspiracy from the beginning. She'd called in sick to ensure that Sarah would be working that night, that Sarah would be the one to discover the irregular patients and ask inconvenient questions. Sarah hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. She'd been deliberately placed in it. But why? The answer came to her as she sat in the diner, watching the storm finally begin to clear. Sarah's reputation for asking questions and fighting for her patients wasn't a liability to Collins, and his operation, it was an asset. They needed someone with medical credentials and an unimpeachable reputation to document their experimental protocols. They hadn't wanted her to stay quiet about what she'd seen. They'd wanted her to become a whistleblower, to expose their operation to the media and trigger a public investigation. Because the investigation would find exactly what they wanted it to find: evidence of a rogue operation conducted by a few bad actors, quickly shut down and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The perfect cover story for a much larger operation that would continue operating in the shadows. Sarah realized she'd been played from the beginning. Her escape had probably been allowed to succeed. Her evidence was probably being delivered to exactly the people Collins wanted to receive it. And now that she'd served her purpose, she'd become a loose end that needed to be tied up. Sarah abandoned her plan to wait for help and instead made her way to the bus station. She bought a ticket to the first destination that didn't require identification, a small town 200 miles away, where she could disappear while she figured out her next move. But as the bus pulled away from the station, Sarah saw familiar black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. Collins and his team were still hunting her, which meant they weren't confident that their plan had worked perfectly. During the 6-hour bus ride, Sarah used a prepaid phone to call Rebecca Chen at the Washington Post. Rebecca answered on the second ring, and Sarah quickly explained the situation. "I received your email," Rebecca said, "but Sarah, you need to know the story's already breaking. Someone leaked information about illegal medical experiments at Mercy General Hospital just hours ago. Federal authorities are raiding the hospital as we speak." Sarah's blood ran cold. Rebecca, that's exactly what they wanted to happen. The raid, the story, the exposure, it's all part of their plan to cover up something bigger. Bigger how? I think the experiments at Mercy General were just a test case. If they're running this operation in one hospital during one storm, they're probably running it in dozens of hospitals during dozens of disasters. They needed a whistleblower to expose one small part of their operation so they could shut it down publicly while the rest of their network continues operating. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, if you're right, then you're not just a witness to medical malpractice. You're the only person who understands the scope of a massive federal conspiracy, which means they're going to kill me. Jake Torres had been a paramedic for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like Hurricane Helena. He'd been a rookie then, working his first major disaster response, and the chaos of that night had stayed with him for years afterward. Now, in 2020, Jake was supervising the decommissioning of old ambulances that had been used during Helena. Most of the vehicles were beyond repair, damaged by salt water and debris, but the department needed to remove all equipment and records before sending them to salvage. Jake was cleaning out the storage compartments of Ambulance 47 when he found a sealed emergency medical bag wedged behind the oxygen tanks. The bag was water damaged but intact, and when Jake opened it, he found something that made him call the police immediately. Inside the bag were medical records, patient intake forms, and a handwritten journal all bearing the name Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The journal detailed everything Sarah had observed on the night she disappeared, but it also contained information that had never been made public. According to Sarah's notes, the operation at Mercy General Hospital had been just one node in a network of similar operations conducted in hospitals across multiple states. During major disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, federal teams would embed in emergency response systems and use the chaos to conduct unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable populations. The journal contained names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of procedures that violated every medical and ethical standard. But most importantly, it contained evidence that the rogue operation exposed in 2009 had been a deliberate sacrifice to protect the larger network. Sarah had figured out the truth, and she died for it. Detective Maria Santos had been investigating cold cases for 8 years, but the Sarah Mitchell file had always bothered her. The official story that Dr. Mitchell had disappeared during Hurricane Helena and was presumed dead had too many loose ends. When Jake Torres brought her Sarah's journal, Maria finally had the evidence she needed to reopen the investigation. The journal not only explained what had happened to Sarah, but it provided a roadmap for investigating the larger conspiracy. Working with FBI agent David Park, who specialized in federal corruption cases, Maria began tracking down the names and locations mentioned in Sarah's notes. What they found was even worse than Sarah had suspected. The network had been operating for over a decade, using major disasters as cover for medical experiments that violated the Nuremberg Code. Homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, and people with mental illness had been systematically kidnapped during emergency responses and used as test subjects for experimental drugs, surgical procedures, and psychological manipulation techniques. The experiments weren't being conducted by rogue agents or corrupt doctors. They were part of a classified government program designed to develop medical countermeasures for biological warfare and terrorist attacks. The program operated under emergency authorities that exempted it from normal ethical oversight, and it was funded through black budgets that were invisible to congressional oversight. Sarah Mitchell had been killed not because she'd discovered a few illegal experiments, but because she'd stumbled onto a systematic program of human experimentation that reached the highest levels of government. But as Maria and Agent Park dug deeper into the conspiracy, they discovered that Sarah's case was just the tip of the iceberg. The journal contained references to other medical professionals who had asked inconvenient questions during disaster responses, and many of them had also died under suspicious circumstances. Dr. Michael Rodriguez had drowned during Hurricane Katrina after discovering irregularities in patient transfers. Dr. Lisa Zhang had been killed in a car accident during the 2008 California wildfires after reporting unauthorized medical procedures. Dr. James Wilson had died of an apparent heart attack during the 2011 tornado outbreak in Alabama, just days after filing a complaint about federal agents interfering with emergency medical care. The pattern was unmistakable once they knew what to look for. Over a 15-year period, at least 12 medical professionals had died under suspicious circumstances after encountering the same type of irregularities that Sarah had discovered. All of their deaths had been ruled accidental or due to natural causes. All of them had occurred during or shortly after major disaster responses. The conspiracy hadn't just killed Sarah Mitchell, it had been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their operations for over a decade. As the investigation expanded, Maria and Agent Park realized they were dealing with something far more sophisticated and dangerous than they had initially understood. The network had infiltrated emergency services across multiple states, had allies in federal agencies at the highest levels, and had demonstrated a willingness to commit murder to protect their operations. But they also realized that Sarah's journal provided them with something the conspiracy had never expected to face: a detailed roadmap of their entire operation, written by someone who had understood the scope of what she was seeing and had documented it with scientific precision. Sarah Mitchell's final act of heroism hadn't just been refusing to stay silent. It had been ensuring that her death would ultimately lead to the destruction of the very system that had killed her. As Maria and Agent Park investigated the network, they realized that Sarah's death had been carefully orchestrated to look like a storm casualty. Her car had been found weeks after Hurricane Helena, crashed and submerged in a flooded area that searchers had initially been unable to access. But forensic analysis of the vehicle analysis that hadn't been possible in 2009 revealed that the crash had been staged. Sarah had been killed elsewhere, and her body and car had been placed in the flood zone to support the official story of her disappearance. The investigation also revealed that Dr. Rebecca Hart, the colleague whose shift Sarah had covered, had been a willing participant in the conspiracy. Rebecca had been recruited years earlier and had been feeding information about potential whistleblowers to Collins and his team. Rebecca had specifically recommended Sarah as someone who could be manipulated into discovering the experiments and exposing them publicly. Sarah's reputation for integrity and her personal history with medical malpractice had made her the perfect unwitting accomplice. But the conspirators had underestimated Sarah's intelligence and investigative skills. Instead of simply reporting what she'd seen and allowing herself to be discredited or silenced, Sarah had figured out the larger scope of the operation and documented evidence that could bring down the entire network. So they'd killed her and made it look like an accident. The investigation into Sarah's death and the broader conspiracy took 3 years to complete. Federal prosecutors had to navigate classified information, government immunity claims, and a defense strategy that argued the experiments had been authorized under emergency powers. But Sarah's journal provided the roadmap for prosecution. Her detailed observations, combined with physical evidence recovered from multiple hospitals and testimony from surviving victims, built an overwhelming case against the conspirators. The trials themselves became a national sensation. For months, the American public watched as the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed in courtroom testimony. Survivors of the medical experiments testified about the horrors they had endured. Government whistleblowers provided evidence of how the program had been concealed from congressional oversight. Medical experts explained how the experiments had violated every ethical standard in modern medicine. Agent Collins, when he finally took the stand in his own defense, showed no remorse for his actions. He argued that the experiments had been necessary for national security, that the victims had been acceptable losses in the effort to protect America from biological weapons attacks. His cold demeanor and bureaucratic justifications for human suffering only strengthened the prosecution's case. Dr. Marcus Webb broke down during his testimony, finally admitting that he had been recruited into the conspiracy through a combination of financial incentives and threats against his family. He revealed that the network had been systematically corrupting medical professionals for years, using blackmail, bribery, and intimidation to build their infrastructure within the healthcare system. Dr. Rebecca Hart maintained her innocence until the end, claiming that she had been manipulated and threatened just like Sarah. But phone records and financial documents revealed that she had been a willing participant for years, receiving substantial payments for identifying potential targets and facilitating operations. The evidence against the conspiracy was so overwhelming that several defendants chose to plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony revealed the full scope of the network, which had conducted unauthorized experiments in over 40 hospitals across 15 states during major disasters spanning 2 decades. Agent Collins was convicted of murder, conspiracy, and violations of federal medical ethics laws. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Dr. Marcus Webb received 25 years in federal prison. Dr. Rebecca Hart was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder. But the most significant outcome of the trials wasn't the individual convictions. It was the exposure of a systematic program that had perverted the medical profession and violated the trust of the American people. The trials led to congressional investigations, reform of emergency response protocols, and the establishment of independent oversight for all federal medical programs. More importantly, the investigation led to reforms in emergency response protocols, stronger oversight of federal medical programs, and compensation for the hundreds of victims who had been experimented on during disasters over more than a decade. The Sarah Mitchell Memorial Act, passed by Congress in the aftermath of the trials, established strict protections for medical professionals who report unethical practices during emergency responses. It also created an independent inspector general for emergency medical services and required congressional notification of any federal medical programs operating under emergency authorities. Sarah's sacrifice had not only exposed a conspiracy, it had fundamentally changed how America protects its most vulnerable citizens during their greatest times of need. 11 years after Hurricane Helena, the truth about Dr. Sarah Mitchell's disappearance finally came to light. She hadn't been a casualty of the storm, she'd been a victim of a conspiracy that had used natural disasters as cover for crimes against humanity. Sarah's journal, hidden in that damaged ambulance for over a decade, had become the key evidence that brought down a network of government officials, federal agents, and medical professionals who had perverted the oath to do no harm into a justification for systematic abuse. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation, established with funds recovered from the conspiracy, now provides oversight for emergency medical protocols and ensures that vulnerable populations are protected during disaster responses. Her story serves as a reminder that the greatest threats to public health often come not from natural disasters, but from those who would exploit such disasters for their own purposes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had saved 43 lives during Hurricane Helena, but her greatest act of heroism was her refusal to stay silent when she discovered that the very system meant to save lives was being used to destroy them. Her courage cost her everything, but it also ensured that hundreds of future victims would be spared the horrors she'd uncovered. In the end, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had kept her oath. She had done no harm, and she had prevented others from causing harm in her name. The storm that took her life had finally given up its secrets, and justice, like her body, had finally been recovered from the depths where it had been hidden for far too long. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey into one of the most disturbing cases I've ever covered. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more crime content and let me know in the comments what case you'd like me to investigate next. Until then, stay safe out there.